What if I told you that Romans 8:28 is not saying what a lot of Christians think it's saying? It says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. A lot of people have been taught wrongly about this passage, and therefore they come to wrong conclusions about this passage. So what we need to do is plug this into its context. When you read the Bible, make sure you understand the main points that have come before this verse, the main ideas, and try and connect those main ideas to what's being said in the current passage you're reading. Okay, so for instance, in this passage, what we have is Paul talking about the future glory that's awaiting the saints of God. We're waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. Creation's waiting for it. The Spirit of God testifies within us that that's coming. But we have to endure suffering. And the way that we endure suffering and anticipate the coming future glory is that the Spirit of God helps us in our weakness. Specifically, the weakness here is that we don't know what to pray for as we ought to in the midst of suffering, waiting for future glory. All right? But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So think about these ideas as we approach verse 28. The idea of enduring suffering. The idea of the Spirit helping us in our weakness as we anticipate future glory. So those three key ideas: present suffering, future glory, and the Spirit's help in the midst of our weakness. Okay? Those three ideas, I want to have them in mind as I read verse 28. Right? Because we're building our way to that. Okay? So it says, we don't know what to pray for as we ought to, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words, and he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit. Because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So the Spirit of God interceding on our behalf is according to the will of God, meaning the Spirit of God doing some intermediary work here, helping us to pray for the things that we don't even know to pray for. In other words, the will of God. That idea relates to verse 28. So when you read the Bible, it is so important that you learn how to not isolate verses and passages from its surrounding context. Okay, so far, the idea is we're heirs with Christ. There's future glory. There's present suffering. The Spirit helps us by interceding for us. He knows the will of God perfectly and can help us pray that when we don't even know it ourselves. Right? So the Spirit of God groans within us in a way that's too deep for words, and this is all according to the will of God. I want to be thinking about those ideas. If you have to list them out on paper or write them on your phone as you read whatever you're going through, do it. It's just helpful to be mindful of those things and see them visually, right? So that you can think of them as you're reading and think about how they connect. So verse 28 says, and when you read the Bible and you come across a conjunction like this, and what's happening here is all the thoughts that are going to come in this verse and that are coming are going to relate to what's been said about typically the last idea, the will of God. Okay, so there's been a sequence of things that Paul has said. The Spirit helps us, and he who searches the hearts helps us, and we know. Okay, so there are some things we don't know. He said this in verse 26. We don't always know what to pray. I don't always know the will of God specifically and individually for my life, but there is something we do know. That for those who love God. And it's very important that you take note of this. For those who love God. That's a condition. That's a kind of person. A specific individual in mind. All things work together for good. So this good is not just a general sense of good, a universal good. This is a specific individual good for the person who loves God. There's a promise here that all things work together, you might say for their good, even though that word isn't put there, for their good. The idea is implied here. He continues, for those who are called according to his purpose. So what we have here is the author, Paul, he repeats what he said in a different way. He repeats the same idea in a different way. Those who love God. What about them? Well, God will make sure all things work together for good, not just generally, but for them. Well, for who? And then he explains it a different way. For those who are called according to his purpose. Now, when you read the Bible, pay very close attention to any repeating ideas or words or even synonymous terms and ideas. For instance, what we have here is the will of God in verse 27. So what I'll probably do for you is I'm going to highlight this in orange, the will of God. There's a synonymous term used, an idea used in verse 28. Those who are called according to his purpose. Now, this might not be the exact same idea, but in my mind, they're at least related. The will of God and the plan of God, if not interchangeably used, they at least are connected, okay? And so pay attention to things like that when you read the Bible to make sense of whatever text you're reading. And something else to do when you read the Bible is ask questions. For instance, what does good here mean? Because not everyone is operating on this with the same definition and standard of good. We need to ask, what does God mean when he says good? Okay? Because not everyone has a right concept of what good actually is. It's not self-defined. It's not relative. This is something that's defined by God himself as good. Now, all things here, we have to plug this into its context. Think about what Paul is saying. He's talking about, how to endure suffering, how to anticipate coming glory. So there's this in-between. There's right now, but not yet, right? In the midst of what I'm going through and in anticipation of what I'm believing for, all things presently are working together for good in a specific direction, right? And the kind of person, again, is that it's for those who are called according to his purpose or those who love God. So what I want to note here is that there's two ways of explaining this kind of person. They love God, okay? And number two, you probably can't see it even if I'm just going to put number two here. They're called. So what I'm going to do is highlight in this weird color the characteristics of the kind of person that God promises all things work together, not just for good in general, but for their good, okay? Not anyone can claim this promise. And that's where I think a lot of believers misunderstand this passage, is we quote this passage as if God is working all things together for the good of every single individual. But the ultimate good, right, is that we would end up in eternity in the kingdom of God as children of God, saved from wrath and, get to reign with Christ in the new creation. That ultimate good that God desires for all people is not actually effectively happening in the lives of all people because not everyone wants it. Not everyone believes. That's why this promise that all things are working together for your good or in the direction of ultimate glory, it's for those who are called. So you have to be called according to God's purpose. You have to be someone who loves God. That's how you can know all things are working together for my good, even in the midst of suffering. Right? So the context is giving believers hope in the midst of present suffering. And the hope is that, yes, there's something great waiting for me, but every detail of my life, all things, God is strategically and perfectly working every detail of my life into his plan to bring about my full redemption and resurrection and new bodies and, making it so that I am raised with Christ and reigning with him in the new creation. He's making sure all of that happens and all things in my life are moving me in that direction. So there's nothing in my life as a believer, as someone who's called according to God's purpose and as someone who loves God, there's nothing in my life that's going to stop the ultimate good he's determined, right? The ultimate good is that I will end up in eternity with God forever, and that's beautiful. Now, verse 29 will explain this purpose. How do you know that? Well, he says, for. Okay. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. This word for is going to operate differently than this word for here. This word for is telling us who, the promise is for. This word right here is a conjunction. It's as if Paul is saying, all things work together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose for. And he's going to explain that more or expand on that idea of those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, which means to know ahead of time, he also predestined, right? To be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So what I want you to see is that there are some additional characteristics of the kind of person who can claim this promise for themselves, right? Not only are they called according to God's purpose, but they're foreknown, they're predestined. They will be conformed to the image of Jesus. They are considered brothers right? Same family as Jesus. And those whom so they're predestined, they're called twice, they're justified, they're glorified. All these descriptions of the kind of person that God is saying, all things I promise in your life are working together for good. Do you know why? Because someone who is called according to God's purpose, right, has a promised end, meaning God has promised a certain end for their life, which is that we end up in eternity with him through faith and by grace alone. So the purpose here is being explained in verse 29 and 30. That's why he says for, and he's going to explain what this purpose is and what it means that they're called. God knew ahead of time who would be predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So here's the purpose of God, that those who believe in the Son will be ultimately changed into the image of his Son. Not only does this speak to our transformation here on planet Earth, not only does this speak to our sanctification and our growing maturity, this speaks to that one day where we are perfectly, ultimately conformed to the image of Jesus, where we are perfectly like him. That's going to happen. That seems to be the hope he's giving believers in the midst of suffering, is that there is good God is working out, like Joseph. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. All things work together for good and play into God bringing about my ultimate conformity to the image of Jesus. All details in my life work out in God's plan to, bring me into glorification. So the people who are called, who love God, are those who are predestined, which is not to the violation of their free will. It doesn't override their free will. God doesn't make the choice for you and I to believe. We choose to believe. But you are someone whom God knows will believe, and you're predestined to be justified and glorified because you've believed. The very simple way of understanding this is that there are two groups of people, those who believe and those who don't. Both groups of people, God has predestined something to happen to either group. If you believe, he's predestined or predetermined that you will be justified, glorified, and called because you've believed. If you don't believe, then that group of people is predestined to not be justified, not be glorified, and not be called into the family of God. So you have no right in his family. You have no right to the tree of life or the kingdom of God. But God has not predetermined who ends up in each category or each group. You believe or you don't. So you decide whether you end up in the group of those who are justified, called, and glorified, or if you don't believe, then you're a part of that group of people, that category of people that are predestined to not experience these things. Okay, so notice this almost unbreakable chain, that if you respond in faith and you're someone who loves God, you are someone who's called according to his purpose. His purpose, right, for you is that one day you will perfectly be conformed to the image of his Son. In the meantime, though, you are slowly being conformed to the image of his Son. Do you see that? And this is so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. In other words, so that Jesus would have others who are made in his image and likeness. And part of your purpose, part of your experience is that, yes, you're justified. You're called to be justified and glorified. And this is the ultimate good that God is moving his people towards, our glorification, where we are one day resurrected from the dead to glorified bodies, right? We're reigning with Christ in the new creation. That ultimate good God is working out, right? He's working all things out to bring us to this ultimate good. He will make sure it happens. Nothing will stop it. Another thing to consider is that what God calls good is that we would, in this world, be conformed to the image of his Son more and more each day, as long as we have breath in our lungs. In other words, what God defines as good is that you would be more and more like Jesus each day. What God defines as good is that one day you will ultimately be glorified, but the road to that glorification is paved with sanctification and more transformation in your life. That's what the path should look like. So we go back to verse 28, and we know this. This is the will of God down here. For those who love God, his will, his purpose is that he will work all things out in his plan of moving us toward glorification, but also all things work together for what he determines is good, which is that in this life, we are more and more like Jesus. So when you read the Bible, ask questions. What is good according to God in this context? What is good is that you'd be more and more like Jesus. So the promise is not that I get what I want. Life is convenient. Life is perfect. No suffering. No, it's actually in the midst of suffering, God promises everything. Everything is moving you towards that one day where you're perfectly conformed and glorified in the image of Christ. But in the meantime, God also promises that here, now, all things are currently working out for your good in terms of making you more and more like Jesus each and every day. So there's a promise we can claim that if you are called by God, you've responded in faith to the invitation, and you're someone who loves God, well, all things in your life are really helping you become more and more like Jesus until that one final day where every detail of your life plays into this ultimate plan of you and I being glorified and reigning with Christ in the new creation. That is the hope in the midst of suffering, the hope that creation and the Spirit of God within us and we ourselves are longing for, that we would be heirs with Christ, fully revealed children of God in the new creation. But in the meantime, there's suffering and weakness, and the Spirit of God helps us by reminding us what is the will of God. His will for you is that you'd be more and more like his Son, because ultimately that's what's going to happen, is perfect conformity to the image of Jesus. So if you guys didn't already know, we have a completely free 40-day Bible study program. If you want to learn how to read the Bible and you're frustrated, confused, overwhelmed, bored, whatever it is, we have a completely free 40-day online Bible study course linked in the description below. Go check that out. If you're interested in learning how to read the Bible better, it'll be a blessing to you. If 40 days is too much, I'll tell you what, we have a 27-day and an 11-day program. You can check out either one of them. Either way, I hope you'll go and check out one of those courses and take your Bible study seriously, and you'll be thankful that you did. All right? And you can always check out abovereproachministry.com for everything that we have. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough.